Hi, welcome to week 2.
This week, it's all about relationships and compassion.
Once again, lots of amazing comments happening on the forums.
And a very interesting and I think for many learners quite a challenging week. And,
Yes.
and which is good, but not always so easy.
Not easy, because I think once we start dealing with interpersonal mindfulness and things like compassion and loving kindness, that's really where the rubber hits the road for a lot of people. It's one thing to perhaps sit and be with ourselves, but then when we start to bring that into our relationships with others, that's when we start to perhaps see patterns that aren't working, or we start to notice areas where we need to grow. And I think that's probably what a lot of the comments are reflecting this week.
Yeah, and I guess it's an indication of how important relationships are to us and how much of social beings we are, because these things are so close to home. And so they do bring up things, and and that can be very helpful, but very revealing as well.
Definitely. A lot of learners really like Kristin Neff's research and her resources on her website, which I strongly recommend everybody to check out if they haven't. She makes some really great distinctions between things like empathy and compassion, between self-compassion and self-esteem. I won't go into a lot of detail about that now because it's all there, but very useful resources.
Yeah, that's right. And many learners talking about or giving examples of bringing compassion into life. So it's one thing to feel compassion for somebody else, but in what way does that compassion become a practical action in life? And it's not like we have to go around all the time looking for something that we can do for somebody else, but just to actually be awake in the moment when something naturally arises. And very often it's quite an intuitive thing. It's an in-the-moment thing.
Yes.
Seeing something that needs to be done. What often happens when we're not mindful is something comes in over the top and sort of interferes with that. It sort of blocks us from doing what might be a very natural, intuitive and caring action in the moment.
What was interesting is a lot of learners this week sort of asking questions around, whether they should give money to homeless people or when's appropriate to do that. And it's almost sort of looking for a formula or a sort of a right and wrong way to do things.
Yeah.
And I think it's very interesting to ask, what's the part of us that's asking questions like that? Because if we look a little bit into that, I think we'd see that there's that contracted, almost sort of egoic part of ourselves that just wants things to be predictable and wants a black and white answer. And I like what you were saying there about really just dropping that and dropping into what feels right for us and what does that situation actually require.
And we should remember, of course, that this is not just about individuals as well. It's about the sort of society we create. So if we create a compassionate society, we create circumstances in which people are cared for, do have their needs met, and so on. So
that's
that,
right.
And I think too, there's one of the interesting things is, and perhaps this can come up a lot in parenting, and perhaps in other walks of life as well, that we sometimes think that the compassionate thing is always to give somebody something that they want.
Yes.
And sometimes the compassionate thing is to know where to draw the line.
Yeah, to say no compassionately.
Yeah, it's not that not caring, but for a child to learn boundaries and to have some level of reasonable discipline or limits is actually a compassionate thing as well as perhaps a reasonable thing.
Yeah.
And so compassion isn't always, somebody's crying out for something, so I've got to give it to them.
No.
It's really a discerning action at the same time.
Well, the wisdom traditions often talk about skillful compassion. If someone's in a hole and feeling a bit lonely, do you jump down there in the hole with them, which might be a short-term solution, or do you go and find a rope or a ladder? Perhaps that's a little bit more skillful.
Yes, that's right.
Of course, sometimes we can't do anything. And so a question came up around mindful listening. If we can't actually fix the problem, what do we do? Do we just sit with people's discomfort and sit with them and connect with them in an empathic way? Do we offer advice, and where do we draw the line?
Yeah.
And I really like this question because it again speaks to that part of us that's perhaps a little bit contracted and just wants to give advice. Now, that's not always a problem giving advice. If we have some experience or we can see something clearly to offer somebody some advice, maybe ask them first, are you open to receiving some advice from me? Mightn't be a bad idea. But what I see a lot in my clients, when I work with my clients, particularly my couples in my private practice, I see that quite often when they're trying to fix their partner's problems, it's because they're experiencing that empathic resonance. They're feeling discomfort and they want to get rid of their own discomfort.
That's right.
So if we're jumping in there, giving advice, trying to fix things to make ourselves feel better, perhaps that's not actually all that skillful.
Yeah.
And if we can make room for our own discomfort and allow the other person to have some discomfort, and then from that place of connection and presence, give a little bit of advice, usually it's a bit more skillful in my experience.
To actually see where the advice is coming from.
Yes.
I need you to be how I want you to be so I can feel right, and which is very different to actually it coming from a place of true compassion.
Definitely, yeah. And why is it so much harder to be compassionate with difficult people?
Look, it's an interesting thing. I reflect on my years of being a medical practitioner and in the work outside of mindfulness as well. And one of the interesting things was when a patient comes in, sometimes patients can be very difficult, sometimes very confronting, and on many different levels. But always when you're in that kind of professional role, there's an objectivity, there's a kind of forgiving understanding that this person may be suffering in one way or another. And the only compass was always how to help the person, how to comfort them, how to provide anything that might be helpful for them. And I think that when in our personal lives things are so much closer to home, all of a sudden, because there's a kind of, I guess in the professional role, something that helps you to take a step or two back.
Yes.
But I think when we get very close and our own attachments are in there and so on, and we don't want this person, this situation, this part of my life to be like that, it creates a lot of tension.
It does, doesn't it?
It's our own attachments, it's our own expectations and assumptions, and I think it's really hard in personal relationships.
Yeah, and also, of course, seeing that patients are in pain often or in fear, and that's perhaps why they're acting those ways.
That's
Sometimes that can lead to that natural compassion as well.
Yeah, because we often see the difficult person on the surface, but we don't see underneath that.
That's right.
That there's a person with their own fears and foibles and so on. And and very often questioning rather than telling. Just being interested and curious what's going on for somebody else. To want to understand somebody rather than to tell them how they should be. Yeah. Very often breaks that down within ourselves, but it helps the person, I think, to progress as well.
Yeah. Now, a lot of our learners found some of the meditations this week quite cathartic.
Yeah. Which is, very helpful. And obviously some quite difficult as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So, And I guess what we've been just saying also comes into changing our relationship with the situation, with the person, less about changing the person themselves. And if those meditations can be helpful in doing that, then that's very useful. Just learning mindfulness in the kind of a general way that we think of it helps people to be more compassionate. But there's research that shows if people actually practice cultivating compassion, they become a whole lot more compassionate than just doing the basic mindfulness training.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think it's actually really interesting that research that you're talking about where just being more mindful might lead to greater empathy and compassion because we're just more aware of what people might be needing. It sort of suggests that perhaps that's our natural state. When we're not caught up in default mode and reactivity, maybe we are naturally compassionate, empathic beings. And then, of course, if we start to practice those things through meditations, that points us back to that basic nature that we have.
Yeah. You look at very young children, there's this kind of natural open-heartedness and so on, but it becomes more and more conditional, more and more limited as time goes on because of the stuff that we accumulate in our own heads.
Yes.
Yeah. Is it just wishful thinking was an interesting question. This Lovingkindness meditation, is it just wishful thinking?
Well, it's not positive thinking or wishful thinking really, because once again, what we're doing is we're deliberately cultivating an attitude of kindness towards ourselves and others, or compassion towards ourselves and others. And that points us again to our own nature, but it also starts to create or strengthen those circuits in the brain, those naturally empathic, compassionate parts of us. Yeah. So every time we make those wishes, it's less about shining out, light and love to the universe, and more about just changing our own brain and changing our own patterns. Yeah. So really, that's the point of it. And we use terms like "may I be happy," "may you be happy," because if we say "you are happy," "I am happy," the brain's immediately going to start arguing with that. But if you make it as an aspiration, it just sort of gets around that in some way,
like something to move towards, a direction to move.
That's right.
Because if we're not moving towards more compassion, then we're probably moving towards more intolerance.
Yes.
Or, so we're just reminding, in a sense, setting our compass.
That's right. Yeah. And of course, we can use any wishes we like. We don't have to stick to the classic sort of wishes. If there's anything that we'd like to wish for ourselves or somebody else that would connect us with that experience of kindness, and compassion, then of course we can be free to use that.
Yeah. Also, difficult relationships and the importance of assertiveness as well.
Yes.
And this is an interesting and important topic that came up.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, we need to be assertive sometimes. As you said before, being compassionate, being kind doesn't always mean just allowing people to do whatever they want. I mean, you've got different flavours of compassion. Most people think of that gentle, soothing kind of compassion that a doctor might bring, a good doctor anyway, with their bedside manner. But then you've got a mother slapping her kid's hand away when he's trying to stick a knife in the PowerPoint or the toaster or something, and that's also compassion. So sometimes it's about saying a strong no to things, and having a lot of assertiveness and really good boundaries can actually be an act of self-compassion so that we don't get harmed. But of course, if someone's harming us, in their own mind, they're creating a whole lot of sort of mental disturbance, and we might want to say no to that on their behalf as well.
I think it takes a lot of self-awareness to be able to make that discernment in the moment, because in that moment, where is that act or response coming from? Because if it's coming from, there's compassion, but there's clarity, and there's a kind of an emotional strength that something that needs to be said or done is being said or done. Is very different to in that moment. There's a flare of anger and
that's right,
and a desire, kind of a harmful intent for somebody else.
That's right. It's a great point because we have to step out of that reactivity, and we also have to step out of that sense of separation. Because if I'm right and you're wrong, and then I'm trying to sort of be assertive there, that's not perhaps as skillful as if we're somehow just humans. We both get caught up in this stuff, and I'm going to say no to this. Right? Sometimes that can make it a little bit more, I guess, skillful in a way.
Yes. And also perhaps one other topic as well about carers and parents and so on. And it's not easy. And I think a number of our learners have been commenting on that. And time poor and under the pump and lots of things going on. At least we can bring a kind of a gentle awareness even to those difficult moments in life. In that moment, there's frustration and irritation and stress and under the pump. At least we can notice that state for ourselves with a kind of a gentleness.
Yes.
Just with a kind of awareness. Maybe just tap the internal, because there might still be demands, but we just, in a sense, just take the intensity out of that moment.
Yeah.
Do what we need to do, but just take the internal tension out of it. And that can help to conserve a lot of emotional and physical energy as well. But like some situations are not easy. I mean, that's black belt mindfulness right there.
Black belt. Any parent or any carer will tell you that it's at least at times it's really hard, and it just is. And sometimes we just need to accept that without wishing things, without thinking that things should be different or judging ourselves for not doing a good enough job, because that just sort of layers on the suffering. Let go of that and just accept, this is hard.
Yeah.
And everything changes and it will get easier.
And that wasn't something happens. It wasn't one of the most conscious moments in our lives, and it's just like, okay, just acknowledge, learn from it, move on, but hopefully with greater self-awareness next time.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Craig, our wonderful mentors reminded us to tell the learners that next week's topics can be quite sensitive and challenging, as if this week's topics weren't challenging enough. Because next week we start looking at self-compassion, which some people find even harder than having compassion for others. So again, just a reminder to go slowly. Feel free to skip any of the exercises and come back to them later. A lot of our repeat learners do that. They might skip it the first time and then slowly dip their toe in a later run of the course. Because we deal with things like self-compassion, emotional health, pain, really challenging topics. So again, just a reminder not to over-disclose personal information. Feel free to skip things and come back to them. And of course, seek support if you become aware that you're dealing with things that are a bit too hard to handle yourself. Professional support, or at least talking to someone that you care about, that cares for you. So it's been great once again, and we'll see you next week.